The noted English author G.K. Chesterton once said that man can be defined as the animal that makes dogma. Now, Chesterton was a convert to Roman Catholic orthodoxy, and he argued that the human ability to formulate and to remain faithful to certain fixed ideas, whether they're religious or political, that this was a key factor in the rise of our advanced civilization. Freethinkers, he maintained, tended to underestimate the constructive power of commonly held systems of belief and how crucial it was to impose those beliefs on the populace. Now, while he questioned on both moral and practical grounds the use of coercion or torture to ensure this ideological conformity, Chesterton's approach to social and religious life was unapologetically doctrinaire, dogmatic. That old Englishman would undoubtedly have been cheered by a message that a man named Peter Kreeft, Boston philosophy professor, brought to Madison just a few years ago. Kreeft is a staunch Roman Catholic, and he was speaking in Madison before an appreciative local audience. And he had harsh words to say about so-called cafeteria Catholics who pick and choose which of the church's teaching to follow. To be a Catholic, he insisted, is to take the whole deal. Don't leave anything out. And he was especially critical of Roman Catholic politicians who opposed the church's position on abortion, like our current president. These, he said, are wicked people. They are people who love power more than they love God. I would say that they are worse than child molesters because their sin is deliberate. It is not a sin of weakness. This abortion is cold, calculating sin that comes straight from the devil. Now, while such stern rhetoric may strike some of us as authoritarian, intolerant, it does reflect a core principle of Kreeft's religious tradition, Roman Catholicism. Orthodoxy, this insistence on correct belief, has been a hallmark of the Roman Catholic Church since its inception in the 4th century AD. So one should not be shocked by this man's desire, his insistence that it be taken seriously. Even today, the pushback against Pope Francis's calls for greater latitude in the church has been considerable. There's a lot of Roman Catholics that don't like that. However, if one is looking for a religion that fits well with one's own private convictions, there's now a multitude of alternatives to choose from, ranging from the most open and permissive, like our own, to the more restrictive and the more narrow. Because unlike in medieval times, affiliation with the Roman Catholic Church is strictly optional. It's not mandatory. If you don't like dogma, then don't dally in it. But back in the olden days, when religious options were few or none, heresy, which in the original Greek simply meant to choose on one's own apart from the community. That's what the Greek term meant, to choose on one's own apart from the community. Well, that was a much bigger deal when the Roman Catholic Church had a monopoly on things. And as recently as just a few centuries ago, the penalties for deviation from the official doctrine, whether Catholic or Protestant, the penalties were quite severe. It's scarcely surprising then that in the past, opponents of orthodoxy often wrote using pseudonyms to hide their identity and avoid persecution. The social critic and essayist Adam Gopnik has addressed the motivation of clerics who, with the Vatican's blessing, carried out the Inquisitions in the late Middle Ages. They were absolutely certain that the existence of the church depended on their inquisitorial activities, he said. If you believe you know the truth of the cosmos or of history, then the crime of causing pain to one person, i.e. persecuting them, is trivial compared to the risk of permitting the death and damnation of uncounted thousands. We had no choice. That's what the Grand Inquisitor announced in Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov. We know the cruelest of fanatics by their exceptionally clear consciences. Well, in the post-Enlightenment world of today, people no longer worry overmuch about an inquisitor type barging into their living rooms. And at least some people now wear that label, heretic, proudly on their sleeves. The late philosopher Walter Kaufmann's intellectual autobiography was entitled The Faith of a Heretic. A similar work by the former Episcopal Bishop James Pike challenged readers with the title that read, "If this be heresy." In other words, if what I am writing here is heresy, so be it. More recently, Spencer Burke, the former minister of an evangelical megachurch, published A Heretic's Guide to Eternity. And there he repudiated many of the dogmas that he had once defended. Choosing on one's own in the contemporary religious marketplace, that's a privilege many of us simply take for granted. Heresy seems to have become quite acceptable in many quarters of our society today, but it wasn't always this way. And if as a culture we are anxious to maintain the freedom that we have achieved in religion, it's well to know how this whole business about orthodoxy, correct belief, how did it get started in the first place? What was the source of this curious tradition that's virtually unknown in any of the great Eastern religions, this insistence on certain absolute propositional truths that should never be questioned, never be challenged, and certainly never rejected? Well, it's hard to make the case for orthodoxy from the teachings of the New Testament, because despite the ardor with which they expressed their opinions, neither Jesus of Nazareth nor Paul of Tarsus was especially doctrinaire. As Spencer Burke observes, meek submission to the doctrinal requirements of a powerful religious establishment, that is something that Jesus rejected with all of his being. Nor did the Apostle Paul demand uniformity of belief among the members of the congregations that he counseled in the early first century. Generally speaking, if you read his letters, Paul placed much greater emphasis on forbearance, acceptance, goodwill, than on ideological purity. There was, in fact, no such thing as orthodoxy. There was no Christian consensus around even the most fundamental theological questions for at least the first 3 centuries of the Christian era. Even those who ate bread and drank wine together to celebrate the Lord's Supper often could not confine the meaning of what they were doing to any single interpretation, so says the historian Elaine Pagels. And so the sacrament of baptism, the relationship of Jesus to God the Father, the meaning of salvation, the likelihood of Christ's second coming, none of these issues were settled and the answers carved in stone. And so Pagel says many of those early Christians were not so much believers as seekers, open-minded, trying to figure out the best answers to those riddles. But you know what? This did not sit particularly well with some prominent followers of Jesus. There was this guy by the name of Irenaeus. He lived in the late 2nd century, and he was the leader of the church in Lyon, France. And it was he who initially used the term heretic with reference to the people who disagreed with him, his religious opponents. And so Irenaeus sought to discredit these alternate perspectives by arguing that his own positions on theological issues were wholly consistent with an unbroken apostolic tradition that stretched all the way back to the original disciples. And he, Irenaeus, he alone was a faithful steward, handing down the foundational, unequivocal, unchanging principles that defined the one true faith. Irenaeus underscored the importance of dogma by proposing that this correct belief, in other words, believe the way I do, was simply a matter of life and death. Only those who thought the way he did were going to be saved. Now, his perspective wasn't embraced immediately by his fellow church leaders. And more than a century would pass before this perspective earned the church's stamp of approval. And that step, as some of you may know, was undertaken by a fellow by the name of Constantine, who was the Roman Empire's first Christian emperor. Now, Constantine was an eminently practical ruler, eager to find some sort of unifying principle that would stabilize and strengthen his rather shaky regime. Now, by this time, we're talking about the early 4th century, most of Rome's citizens were already Christians. But they belonged to a multitude of different competing sects of Christianity. Now, convinced that his own interests were not well served by so much religious diversity, Constantine allied himself with the group that he believed was the best organized, the most disciplined, and he made their faith and their principles his own. Now, in order to ensure the dominance of this favored group, the emperor granted tax exemptions to members of their clergy, and at the same time, he imposed tax increases on the heretical rivals. Well, when this proved to be an insufficient incentive, Constantine raised the stakes. Camps other than the one in which he was invested were now ordered to stop holding meetings and to surrender whatever property they owned to his one holy Catholic Church. They had to give up all of their property. According to one estimate, as many as half of all Christians in the Roman Empire at that time were deemed heretical, illegitimate, by virtue of Constantine's orders. So if you were a non-conforming Christian, it was pretty much all downhill from there. With full access to the coercive powers of the state, the Catholic Church would create and maintain a virtual religious monopoly in Western Europe for over 1,000 years. To be fully human, Lauren Mead writes, was to be a Christian and to be a loyal member of the empire. To be outside of either was to be outside of the law. It would be making yourself into an outlaw. Now, although the Roman Catholic Church's dominance declined during the Protestant Reformation, the concept of orthodoxy was here to stay, readily adapted by Lutherans, Calvinists, Anglicans, and so there were few safe havens for so-called heretics until well into the 18th century. And heterodox opinions were as likely to be suppressed in England as in Italy, in Switzerland as in Spain. And so early exponents of Unitarianism, men such as Michael Servetus, Francis David, John Biddle, they were all the victims of persecution. And even in the first years of the American Republic, one of the revolution's true heroes, Thomas Paine, was literally hounded out of this country on account of his radical religious views. Now, the late philosopher Robert Solomon has said that although belief is certainly a component of our spiritual life, it is not the central concern of spirituality. Spirituality, he said, ought to be an expression of one's overall orientation toward life. It has more to do with certain attitudes like reverence and gratitude and awe and wonder and compassion and curiosity. True spirituality emphasizes being rather than believing. And thus, theoretically, a heretic can be as profoundly spiritual as any champion of orthodoxy. Now, institutional religion, the communal manifestation of our spirituality, well, that's also concerned with belief. But again, this is not the most salient feature of institutional religion. What really matters is a sense of belonging that one enjoys as part of a beloved community that provides us with a measure of security and support and comfort, like this community with which we are gathered today. And so we must get over our need to interpret religions as alternative systems of knowledge, Solomon says, for that is not where their value truly lies. The highly regarded sociologist Robert Bellah agrees with that assessment. He says the churches should aim to provide a favorable environment for people to work out their own solutions to questions of the sacred without imposing a prefabricated set of answers. And yet, religion in the West has had a devil of a time breaking free of the ideological fetters with which it has been bound for 17 centuries. And speaking of his own experience in an orthodox environment, Spencer Burke complains that the institutional church is obsessed with boundaries. Who's in? Who's out? Who's saved? Who's lost? In general, he says, institutional churches today don't ask questions. They present answers, answers to questions that people in our culture really aren't even asking. So although heresy is much more common now than it once was, for a significant number of people, religion is still all about belief, submission to certain unassailable authoritative truths. People of all persuasions have been taught that asking questions about matters such as God is somehow demeaning to their faith, the cognitive scientist Daniel Dennett observes. Demeaning to your faith, just ask a question. This was something one of my late colleagues, John Wolfe, discovered very early in his life. And it is what propelled him into the Unitarian Universalist ministry. This is the story that John tells. When he was young, he had a friend by the name of Eddie. They were both 7 or 8 years old. Eddie lived down the street from John. And Eddie was one of these really curious kinds of kids who didn't think twice about asking questions about everything. One day, however, he asked the kind of question that just was not permitted in his no-nonsense religious household. And John wasn't sure. He didn't remember whether Eddie actually posed this question to his parents or maybe to his minister. But in any case, the question resulted in a spanking, forfeiture of his allowance, and 7 days of home detention. What was this horrible question that he asked? He had innocently asked whether Jesus smelled after he had been dead for 3 days in the tomb. That's not an unreasonable question to pose, because Jesus himself, if you read the Gospels, had been warned about the stench coming from Lazarus' tomb when he arrived to raise him from the dead. Well, in any case, John Wolfe had another neighbor, a kindly older man by the name of Charlie. And when Charlie found out about Eddie's severe punishment, it made him hopping mad. I shall never forget what Charlie told me, John said. He said, people like that, people like Eddie's parents, they think they're going to solve the world's problems by keeping their minds closed and by telling their children that there are things that you just don't ask questions about, much less come right out and say something like that. But they're wrong, said Charlie. It doesn't matter how right they think they are wrong. Question everything, Charlie used to tell me. It was his way of teaching me about values. It was his way of saying, in matters of ethical principle, the willingness to ask questions ranks right up there near the top. So although the most conservative and traditional branches of Christianity and Islam still insist on this doctrinal conformity, on this submission to authority, nowadays, it isn't that easy for religions and cultures to avoid scrutiny and to impose those dogmas without equivocation. There's too much information that's now available to all of us online. Our culture has become too diverse, too interconnected. Modern science has punched too many holes in religion's cherished truths. And so indeed, in his 2009 inaugural address, Barack Obama made the unprecedented assertion that the United States is really a nation comprised not only of Christians and Jews and Muslims and Hindus, but of unbelievers as well. He said it right out there. What more legitimacy could a heretic ask for? But although it has made considerable strides, heresy hasn't quite gone mainstream. In America today, no one's going to be pilloried for exposing the patriarchal biases of the Bible, as Elizabeth Cady Stanton was in 1896. Literally lost her reputation because of her book questioning the patriarchal themes in the Bible. And it is probably inconceivable that any one of us would be fined or imprisoned by a US court for blasphemy, as happened to a freethinker by the name of Ruggles in 1811. In that particular case, Judge Kent of the New York Supreme Court wrote for the majority, "The free, equal, and undisturbed enjoyment of religious opinion is granted, but the abuse of that right, as in the case of blasphemy, well, that has a tendency to corrupt the morals of people and to destroy the good order." And thus, Ruggles was imprisoned. Still, even in a society that has achieved as much openness as ours, certain beliefs are still generally deemed to be socially and religiously suspect. We may not think of ourselves, at least most of us, as living in a Christian nation, but according to the vast majority of people, we still live in a nation where we're supposed to be God-fearing. And that's one reason that atheists are still looked at askance by a significant majority of Americans. So yes, this thing called heresy, the freedom to choose apart from the larger community, is a principle that most of us as religious progressives warmly endorse. But we must also be aware that this is a tenuous, hard-won, recent freedom that our forebears were denied in the past, and that certainly can be forfeited again. The great enemy of free thought is always fear. And when fear begins to besiege a society, when it begins to cause us to circle the wagons, then heresy once more becomes intolerable. Adam Gopnik reminds us that we had our own Torquemada, our own Grand Inquisitor in this country not that long ago. He was a man who fed on fear, and his name was J. Edgar Hoover. And he was, as Gopnik says, as scary an inquisitorial type as any. And he says he would certainly have tortured and executed communists that he imagined besieging America if he had had the chance. Fortunately, he never had the chance. Mostly, J. Edgar Hoover lost. And what made him lose was the persistence of traditions and laws around civil liberties. We have been party to a fragile triumph of Enlightenment values. It's a bloody miracle, really. Well, there is a gentleman currently running for president who seems to be cut out of the same cloth as J. Edgar Hoover. Will our traditions and our laws be strong enough to stymie him as well? Right now, it is a disturbingly open question. And on that positive note, thus endeth the reflections.